June 1941, German invasion of the Soviet Union. In the late night of June 21, 1941, to the west of the Brest Fortress on the Soviet-German border, the chirping of summer night insects, usually the most common background sound of the border, was gradually drowned out by a faint, indistinct vibration, growing quieter by the minute. Ivan Petrov, a 22-year-old Soviet sentry, pulled his faded military overcoat tighter around himself. Issued the previous winter, the coat still carried a whiff of camphor in June, yet it offered little protection against the sudden drop in night temperature. Leaning against the wooden wall of the guard post, he used the dim glow of a kerosene lamp to finish the letter he had started writing to his mother earlier that day. "Mom, the rye beside the post is almost ripe. My comrades say we'll get fresh bread when it's harvested, but I'm afraid I won't be able to come home for the autumn harvest this year. Don't worry, though, telegrams from Moscow always say the border is safe." No sooner had his pen traced the word "safe" than the ground trembled again, this time more distinctly, like the rumble of countless horse-drawn carriages traveling in the distance. Frowning, Ivan folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. He grabbed the binoculars hanging on the wall and hurried up to the observation tower outside the guard post. The night sky was moonless, with only a few stars dotting the inky blue. He gazed westward along the border, toward the occupied Polish territory, which should have been pitch black. Instead, a faint glint of metal flickered at the edge of the forest. Immediately after, a low engine roar drifted over on the wind. It was not the sound of the four-cylinder engine of a Soviet patrol vehicle, it was more like the dull rumble of tank engines running at low speed, and there was more than one. Could it be a drill? Ivan wondered. He recalled the order issued by the military district the previous week, stating that the German army might conduct defensive drills near the border and urging soldiers not to panic. But just as he lowered the binoculars, he heard the faint whir of propellers overhead, not the sound of a Soviet P-2 reconnaissance aircraft. This noise was denser, like a swarm of giant mosquitoes hovering high in the sky. He looked up sharply, and by the light of the stars, he made out the blurry silhouettes of several aircraft, with something seemingly hanging beneath their wings, flying low along the clouds toward the southeast. At the same time, 50 kilometers away, in the position of the German 2nd Panzer Group, 34-year-old tank commander Gunther Müller sat in the driver's cabin of his Panzer IV tank, running his fingers repeatedly over the control lever. The clock on the instrument panel showed 2:50 a.m., 25 minutes before the operation begins. Around his tank, hundreds of identical tanks were hidden in the forest, their tracks wrapped in branches, their gun barrels pointing east toward the Soviet border. The company commander's voice came over the intercom: "Check ammunition, warm up the engines, and maintain radio silence. At 3:15, we'll make the Soviets remember this time." Gunther pressed the engine start button, a low roar spread through the forest. He looked out the cabin window, where moonlight filtered through the gaps in the leaves and fell on his comrades' steel helmets. No one had much expression on their faces, but everyone gripped their rifles tightly. In the Moscow Kremlin, Stalin's office was still lit. 3 intelligence reports were spread out on his desk. The top one, marked "Urgent" in red ink, was from the Soviet General Staff Intelligence Directorate. According to reports from embedded informants, the German army has massed large armored units in border areas such as Brest and Minsk and may launch an attack in the coming days. Stalin tapped the report with his finger, furrowing his brows into a tight knot. This was the 5th similar intelligence report he had received in a week, yet the German Foreign Ministry had sent a note just the day before, stating that Germany will continue to abide by the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union. He picked up the phone and connected to the dedicated line of General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Special Military District. "Tell the border troops not to believe rumors. Do not open fire on the German army without my order, understand?" When Pavlov gave an affirmative reply over the phone, Stalin hung up, pushed the intelligence report to the corner of the desk, and turned toward the rest area. He thought this was nothing more than another intimidation trick by the German army. On the observation tower, Ivan was still staring westward. The glints of metal at the edge of the forest grew more numerous, the engine roars louder, and he could even see countless faint vehicle headlights forming a line in the darkness, like a slowly moving steel serpent emerging from the forest and approaching the border. He suddenly remembered what Lydia, the intelligence officer, had said when she delivered documents to the guard post the previous week: "Ivan, keep a close eye on the west. Something doesn't feel right." He had paid little attention to it then, but now a chill ran up his spine from the soles of his feet. He grabbed the phone in the guard post to report to the battalion headquarters, but only a faint hissing of static came from the receive. At 3:10 a.m., a string of red signal flares suddenly lit up the western sky. Immediately after, countless searchlight beams shot up from the German positions, illuminating the border as bright as day. Ivan instinctively dropped to the floor of the observation tower, his heart pounding. He finally realized that the vibrations, the engine roars, and the glints of metal were not part of a drill. At 3:15 a.m., the first thunder of artillery shattered the night. In an instant, hundreds of artillery shells rained down on the Brest Fortress. The wooden wall of the guard post was torn apart by the shockwave, the kerosene lamp fell to the ground, and flames licked at the scattered letter paper. The words, "The border is safe," were soon blurred by thick smoke. Ivan scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle from the ground, and ran toward the battalion headquarters. He sprinted past the rye fields and across the border barbed wire. The sound of explosions grew closer behind him, and in the sky, the shrill scream of German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers sounded like the trumpets of death. He did not know that at that moment, along the 1,800-kilometer-long Soviet-German border, countless Ivans were experiencing the same moment of terror. With this burst of artillery fire, the largest land invasion in human history officially began. The pre-war gambit, Hitler's ambition and the Soviet miscalculation. December 18, 1940. In the underground situation room of the Berlin Chancellery, the faint hum of heating pipes did little to dampen Adolf Hitler's exhilaration. Standing before a massive map of the German-Soviet border, his finger traced a line from Minsk, through Smolensk, to Moscow. As his pen signed the first page of the Operation Barbarossa plan, the ink soaked into the paper. The plan's core objective, to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign within 3 months, stemmed not only from his hubris following the Blitzkrieg victories in Western Europe but also from a deep-seated ideological prejudice. "The Soviet Union is a rotten empire held together by ideology," he roared at the generals gathered around the table. "Their soldiers have no fighting spirit, their commanders are inept. Our tanks will break through their lines like a hot knife through butter." The commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, secretly clenched his fist. Just the day before, he had submitted a memorandum pointing out that the USSR possessed 19 million square kilometers of strategic depth, approximately 5 million men in its standing army, and that the armor of the T-34 tank far exceeded that of the German PZ.3. The goal of a 3-month victory, he argued, was unrealistic. Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder added, "We need at least 80 reserve divisions for winter operations. Our current logistical reserves can only sustain 4 months of combat." But Hitler waved them off, gesturing to a photograph on the wall of the French surrender. "In 1940, you also said Britain was invincible. And the result? Now, carry out the orders." After the meeting, Brauchitsch's memorandum was locked in the Situation Room's safe, only discovered by the Allies after the war, bearing Hitler's red-inked annotation, "The worries of a coward." From that day, the Germans initiated the secret build-up codenamed Aufbau Ost, Build-up East. By March 1941, the Königsberg railway station in East Prussia echoed with the muffled sounds of trains every night, trains painted in civilian freight colors, their carriages packed with PZ.3 tanks, with a 50mm main gun and 30mm frontal armor, and MG-42 general-purpose machine guns. To avoid detection, the Germans mandated that trains could only run between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., with loading and unloading times at each station not exceeding 1 hour. Soldiers disembarking were to immediately disappear into temporary shelters in the forests. By April, over 2,000 concealed ammunition depots had been established along the Bug River in eastern Poland, each stockpiling 1,200 tons of artillery shells, 800,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, and 300 tons of hardtack. Pipelines from the Romanian oil fields were rerouted, funneling 5,000 tons of gasoline daily via underground pipes to the border, enough to keep 3,700 tanks running continuously for 1,000 kilometers. To conceal their intentions, the Germans meticulously orchestrated the deception plan, Operation Hardwood South. On the Channel coast near Calais, engineers erected 150 inflatable tanks made of canvas and steel tubing. These decoys, complete with realistic-looking gun barrels and tread marks, even used air blowers during the day to simulate the heat haze of engine exhaust. Near Dunkirk, 300 civilians were hired to pose as German soldiers, conducting drill formations daily on the beaches, intentionally allowing Soviet spies to photograph their exercises. The German newspaper Völkischer Beobachter published an article titled, "Wehrmacht Strengthens Western Defenses Against Possible British Landing," accompanied by a picture of soldiers setting up barbed wire on the Calais coast. More misleadingly, the German Foreign Ministry continued friendly trade with the Soviet Union. Between January and May 1941, Germany exported 2,030 trucks, 150,000 tons of petroleum, and 800 machine tools to the USSR, while the Soviets supplied Germany with 600,000 tons of grain, 1 million cubic meters of timber, and 3,000 tons of cotton. In the trade report Stalin received, the Soviet Foreign Trade Commissar, Anastas Mikoyan, specifically noted, German compliance rate 100%, cooperative atmosphere positive. Meanwhile, in Moscow, warning signs were being ignored, layer by layer. In April 1941, Chief of the General Staff Georgy Zhukov presented a border defense plan at a monthly meeting. He proposed reinforcing the western border with 15 additional armored brigades and 300 fighter aircraft, and concentrating tanks rather than dispersing them among infantry divisions. But Stalin frowned and pushed the plan aside. "Comrade Zhukov, have you forgotten the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Reinforcing our troops will make the Germans think we are provoking them. This will destroy the hard-won peace." When Zhukov tried to argue, Stalin cut him off. "The current priority is developing heavy industry, not creating military friction." The struggles of field agents were even more futile. Lydia Vassilieva, a 28-year-old operative operating undercover as a clerk in the German Army Quartermaster Corps, in Berlin, had a source codenamed Adler, Eagle, a major on the general staff. On May 12, 1941, Adler risked everything to hand her a document stamped, "Top Secret," the Operation Barbarossa Force Deployment Table. It detailed the allocation of 5.5 million troops, Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, with 29 divisions deployed in East Prussia, targeting Leningrad, Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, with 50 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions, deployed near Warsaw, targeting Moscow, Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, with 41 divisions deployed in Romania, targeting Kiev. Lydia microfilmed the table onto the back of a postcard and sent it to Moscow via the diplomatic pouch. After 10 days, she only received a reply from Intelligence Directorate: "Be wary of German counterintelligence. Do not trust single-source information lightly." On May 28, Lydia received another urgent message from Adler. German units had received orders to enter attack positions by June 22, and Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were practicing attacks on Soviet airfields. She decided to deliver the intelligence personally. Disguising herself as a German businesswoman, she took a train to Brest on the Soviet-Polish border. At the border checkpoint, as a German sentry rummaged through her luggage, the notebook containing the intelligence almost slipped out. She managed to bluff her way through by claiming it was a business contract. Upon reaching Brest, she went straight to the headquarters of the Western Special Military District, finding its chief of intelligence, Major General Alexander Golikov. "German tanks are already in the forests outside the city. The attack will come on June 22. You must report this immediately." Golikov, however, pointed to a copy of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the wall and said sternly, "Comrade Lydia, Comrade Stalin has repeatedly emphasized the need to maintain German-Soviet friendly relations. Your intelligence could be a deliberate German leak, aimed at causing panic. He even confiscated Lydia's notebook, saying it needed to be verified in Moscow. But as late as June 20, this intelligence had still not reached Stalin's desk. The combat readiness of Soviet border troops was even more alarming. In June 1941, the Western Special Military District, responsible for the Minsk direction, deployed 2.9 million troops, 1.8 million of whom were peasants conscripted in 1940. Many had received only 3 months of basic training. On the training grounds of the Brest Fortress, 22-year-old sentry Ivan Petrov and his comrades were still practicing drill and bayonet charges. They had never conducted anti-tank drills. A third of their rifles were vintage Mosin, Nagant M1891s from World War I, with only 30 rounds of ammunition issued per man. Their only heavy weapons were 1918 production Maxim heavy machine guns, with just 2 per company. When General Dmitry Pavlov inspected the fortress on June 10, he saw soldiers' helmets still smeared with mud from training and reprimanded them. Your duty is to guard the border, not prepare for war. Our German comrades will not attack us without reason. Maintaining a neat appearance is more important than practicing marksmanship. More fatally, the deployment of Soviet equipment was completely exposed to German eyes. Of the Western District's 1,800 tanks, 1,200 were dispersed among various infantry divisions, each division assigned only 20 to 30 tanks, preventing any concentrated striking force. Though 98 new T-34 tanks, with 45 mm frontal armor and a 76 mm main gun, had arrived at the border, they lacked radio equipment and could not coordinate effectively. The 1,500 aircraft at the airfields, mostly obsolete I-16 fighters, were neatly lined up on open runways, without any anti-aircraft shelters, following Stalin's order that, concentrating aircraft facilitates management and shows the Germans we have no intention of preparing for war. On June 18, when a German reconnaissance plane flew over Brest airfield and photographed the densely parked aircraft, the commander of Luftflotte II, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, laughed and told his staff, on the first day of war, we can destroy 80% of their planes. Final preparations within the German ranks accelerated. On June 20, the Wolf's Lair headquarters issued the final directive to all Army groups. Army Group North would commence artillery bombardment at 3:15 on June 22, Army Group Center would follow at 3:20, and Army Group South at 3:25, ensuring a simultaneous three-pronged breakthrough to prevent the Soviets from supporting each other. That day, German soldiers were notified about the distribution of the last letter home before the offensive. Gunther Müller, a 34-year-old tank commander, wrote in his letter, "My dear wife, I will soon finish my task and come home. We will spend Christmas in Moscow." He did not know this letter would never be sent. It was found after the war, still tucked inside his tank's driver compartment. And in Moscow, the night of June 21 was exceptionally calm. At a dinner in the Kremlin, Stalin and the Politburo members were discussing the grain procurement plan for the second half of the year. When someone mentioned unusual activity reported from the border, Stalin waved his hand dismissively, "That's just routine German military exercises. No need for alarm." At the same moment, in a small hotel in Brest, Lydia received one last telegram from Adler, "Plan unchanged. Take care." She knew it was too late to change the course of events and could only pray, gazing at the night sky outside her window. Along the border, Ivan Petrov was writing a letter home from his sentry post. He did not know that, 1,800 kilometers away, in German positions, the engines of 3,700 tanks were beginning to warm up, and the propellers of 4,900 aircraft were about to start turning. An invasion that would alter the course of World War II was creeping closer with the approaching dawn. Blitzkrieg raid, a 1,800-kilometer steel onslaught, dawn of June 22, 1941, early July. At 3:10 a.m. on June 22, 1941, red signal flares lit up simultaneously along the 1,800-kilometer-long Soviet-German front. This was the signal for the full-scale offensive of Germany's Operation Barbarossa. In the Leningrad direction under the jurisdiction of Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, Soviet sentries at Riga airfield had just spotted dense dark spots in the sky when 120 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers came roaring down. Known as Stukas, these bombers, emitting shrill dive sirens, pounced on the tarmac like falcons, with 50 kilograms bombs dropping one after another from under their wings. Before the I-16 Rada fighters of the Soviet 6th Air Army could take off, 47 of them were destroyed on the ground. Pillars of flame from exploding fuel depots soared over 30 meters high, illuminating the entire airfield's night sky. 24-year-old Soviet pilot Alexander Pokrishkin, later the top ace pilot of the Soviet Air Force in World War II, was lying in his barracks when he heard the explosions. He grabbed his flight suit and rushed to the tarmac, only to see his own fighter with its cockpit pierced by shrapnel and wings billowing black smoke. "Hurry into the air raid shelter," a comrade pulled him away, while the thunder of a shot-down SB fast bomber crashed behind them. That dawn, German aircraft of Army Group North flew 800 sorties, destroying 18 Soviet airfields and shooting down or damaging 320 Soviet aircraft, nearly paralyzing air defense in the Leningrad direction. Meanwhile, the steel onslaught of Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tearing through the Bug River defense line. 34-year-old German tank commander Gunther Müller was driving a Panzer IV tank, equipped with a 75mm main gun, high-explosive shells, and armor-piercing shells, belonging to the 18th Panzer Division of the 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by Heinz Guderian. At 3:20 a.m., his tank platoon charged toward a temporary pontoon bridge over the Bug River under artillery cover, a bridge secretly built by German combat engineers at 2 a.m., only wide enough for two tanks to pass side by side. "Watch the anti-tank gun on the left," the company commander shouted over the radio. Müller immediately maneuvered the tank to turn, and a single armor-piercing shell from the main gun hit a hidden Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun in the woods along the riverbank, engulfing the gun crew in smoke instantly. At that moment, infantry from the Soviet Fourth Army rushed out of their trenches, trying to stop the tanks with Molotov cocktails. Müller's machine gunner immediately opened fire with the coaxial machine gun, and bullets kicked up white streaks in the snow. There was still residual snow in northern Russia in June. By 7 a.m., the 18th Panzer Division had broken through the Soviet first line of defense and advanced toward Minsk. The Soviet resistance encountered along the way was sporadic and disorganized. Many Soviet infantry companies lacked a complete command structure, and some company commanders were surrounded by German tanks before even receiving the order to enter combat status. The offensive of Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, focused on the Lviv region on the outskirts of Kiev. Here, the Soviet Sixth Army had deployed a relatively large force, about 120,000 troops, and was equipped with a small number of T-34 tanks, attempting to block the Germans using the terrain of the Carpathian Mountains. However, the German 1st Panzer Group, commanded by Ewald von Kleist, adopted a flank envelopment tactic, with the 13th Panzer Division as the vanguard, bypassing the Soviet front line and inserting itself behind Lviv from the Romanian border. At 9 a.m. on June 22, German armored forces suddenly appeared at the railway hub southwest of Lviv, cutting off the Soviet supply lines. Lieutenant General Mikhail Petrovich Musichenko, commander of the Soviet Sixth Army, urgently ordered the reserve forces to counterattack, only to find that most of the reserve's trucks were still parked in warehouses. German air raids had destroyed 70% of the transport vehicles, forcing soldiers to march to the battlefield on foot. 28-year-old Soviet infantryman Nikolai Ivanov ran 15 kilometers with his rifle on his back. As soon as he reached his position, he encountered a German tank charge. He and his comrades lay in the trenches, firing their rifles at the tanks, but the bullets could not even penetrate the armor. "Grab the Molotov cocktails," the squad leader shouted. Nikolai picked up a gasoline-filled bottle, lit the fuse, and threw it at a German tank, only to be shot in the thigh by the tank's machine gun, collapsing into the trench. That day, German forces of Army Group South advanced 25 kilometers, captured over 8,000 Soviet soldiers, and destroyed 12 T-34 tanks. Lacking radio coordination, these T-34s could only fight independently and were eventually surrounded and eliminated one by the Germans. Soviet command chaos reached its peak that day. When General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Special Military District, received reports of the border defense line being breached at 4 a.m., his first reaction was that, this is a local provocation by the Germans. It was not until 10 a.m., when he saw telegrams from various units reporting total collapse of the defense line, that he realized the gravity of the situation. He tried to deploy reserve forces through the district's communication center, only to find that the telephone lines had long been cut by German paratroopers. At 3 a.m., 1,200 paratroopers from the German 7th Airborne Division had parachuted near Minsk, destroying Soviet communication stations and railway hubs, completely cutting off contact between the Western Special Military District and its subordinate armies. Pavlov could only take a P-2 reconnaissance aircraft to the front line, but was intercepted by German Bf-109 fighters midway and forced to turn back. Meanwhile, in Minsk, citizens were still unaware that war had broken out, bakeries were open as usual, and trams were still running. It was not until 12 p.m., when German bombers flew overhead and dropped their first batch of bombs, that people panicked and rushed to air raid shelters. Germany's Blitzkrieg relied not only on armor and air power, but also on highly effective coordinated tactics. Along Army Group Center's offensive route, each armored unit was equipped with forward observers, soldiers carrying radios who rode motorcycles to reconnoiter Soviet positions in advance, transmit coordinates to rear artillery, and then guide tanks in their charge. At 11 a.m., Gunther Muller's tank platoon encountered a village garrisoned by a Soviet reinforced company. Forward observers quickly transmitted coordinates, and 5 minutes later, shells from German 150mm howitzers fell on the village, destroying Soviet machine gun positions. Muller seized the opportunity to command his tanks to charge into the village, only to find most Soviet soldiers hiding in houses, some even boiling potatoes. They had never expected the Germans to arrive so soon. "Surrender and you will not be harmed," Muller shouted through the tank's loudspeaker. 23 Soviet soldiers walked out of the houses holding their rifles, with their company commander still clutching an undistributed defense deployment map in his hand. By the afternoon, sporadic but fierce Soviet resistance began to emerge. Along the coast of the Gulf of Riga, where Army Group North was attacking, a battalion of the Soviet 10th Infantry Division held an unnamed high ground, using mortars and heavy machine guns to block the advance of the German 16th Army. Major Vasily Petrov, the battalion commander, led his soldiers in digging 3 lines of trenches, positioned anti-tank guns at the top of the high ground, and repelled 3 German charges in a row. The Germans deployed Ju-87s to bomb the high ground, collapsing many sections of the trenches. Petrov's left arm was wounded by shrapnel, but he still insisted on commanding. It was not until 6 p.m., when the Germans dispatched a tank company, that the high ground's defense line was breached. By then, only 47 soldiers remained in the battalion. In his final moment, Petrov pulled the pin on a hand grenade and died together with the onrushing Germans. This battle delayed the Germans by 2 hours, buying time for the evacuation of some civilians in Riga. On June 22 alone, the German advance speed set a record for land combat in World War II. Army Group Center advanced 50 kilometers, Army Group North 35 kilometers, and Army Group South 25 kilometers. By 11:59 p.m. that day, the Germans had destroyed 1,800 Soviet aircraft, 1,500 of which were destroyed on the ground, captured 32,000 Soviet soldiers, broken through the Soviet defense line to a depth of 80 kilometers, and formed an initial encirclement posture in the 3 directions of Minsk, Riga, and Lviv. The Soviet Western Special Military District suffered the heaviest losses. The command structures of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies were basically shattered. Deprived of unified command, soldiers could only fight on their own. Some broke out into the forests, while others were captured by the Germans. Late at night, by the Bug River, Gunther Muller's tank was parked in a wheat field with its engine still idling. He climbed out of the tank, checked the map by moonlight, and realized they had crossed 50 kilometers into Soviet territory. Firelight could still be seen in distant villages, and occasional sporadic gunshots echoed. A communications soldier handed him a battle report: "Our division destroyed 47 Soviet tanks and captured 2,000 prisoners today." Muller nodded, took out a photo of his wife from his backpack. The edges were already soaked with sweat. He did not know that this Blitzkrieg would not end in 3 months, as Hitler had promised. The victory before him was only the beginning, and the long, harsh Eastern Front winter was waiting for them. Meanwhile, in the Moscow Kremlin, Stalin finally convened an emergency meeting, approving the order for the entire country to enter a state of war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was appointed commander of the Western Front, responsible for organizing the defense of the Minsk direction. The Soviet counteroffensive was truly beginning to take shape from this moment on. Meat grinder, the Kiev encirclement and Smolensk stalemate, July-September 1941. On July 10, 1941, along the Dnieper River outskirts of Smolensk, the morning mist had not yet lifted when Panzer IV tanks of the German 3rd Panzer Group, commanded by Hermann Hoth, crushed through the Soviet forward trenches. At this time, Army Group Center was executing Hitler's order to first encircle and eliminate Soviet forces in Smolensk before advancing on Moscow. Smolensk was the only route to Moscow, and the Soviet Western Front, commanded by Georgy Zhukov, had concentrated 76 divisions and 1,000 tanks, only 120 of which were T-34s, attempting to build an in-depth defense line along the Dnieper and Desna rivers to block the German steel onslaught. The battle descended into a stalemate from the very start. The German 7th Panzer Division, the Ghost Division, launched an assault at 8 a.m. After the tank formation broke through the Soviet first-line trenches, it was ambushed by Soviet anti-tank guns hidden in the woods. 28-year-old Soviet gunner Vasily Petrov operated a 45mm anti-tank gun, firing continuously when German tanks were 500 meters away. 2 armor-piercing shells hit the side armor of a Panzer III tank, which ground to a halt instantly, and its crew scrambled out in panic. "Take another one down!" Vasily shouted, but just as he loaded the next shell, German MG-42 machine gun fire raked in. His left arm was hit, and blood streamed down the gun barrel. Comrades tried to drag him to the rear, but he clung tightly to the gun mount. "I can still fight." It was not until a third German tank closed in that Vasily pulled the pin on a hand grenade and died together with the tank. On that day, Soviet anti-tank units in the Smolensk direction destroyed 87 German tanks, but at the cost of 12,000 casualties. With the German advance stalled, Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was forced to change tactics. On July 15, he ordered his armored forces to bypass the Soviet front line and outflank from Yelnya, southeast of Smolensk, in an attempt to cut off the Soviet retreat. This tactic initially worked. The German 18th Panzer Division advanced 40 kilometers in 3 days, captured Yelnya railway station, and seized 1,200 tons of Soviet grain reserves. However, Zhukov immediately dispatched 3 infantry divisions of the 20th Army to counterattack. Soviet soldiers charged at German tanks with Molotov cocktails, engaging in house-to-house fighting at the railway station. 25-year-old Soviet infantryman Ivan Semyonov was hit by shrapnel in his right leg during the battle, but still persisted in covering his comrades with his rifle. "Hold this position, and the Germans can't get around behind us." This seesaw battle lasted 11 days. Although the Germans finally held Yelnya, they lost 150 tanks and 23,000 soldiers, and their advance speed plummeted from 20 kilometers per day to 5 kilometers. The meat grinder of Smolensk made the Germans feel the tenacious resistance of the Soviet army for the first time. Meanwhile, Army Group South focused its attention on Kiev. On August 23, the German 1st Panzer Group, commanded by Ewald von Kleist, broke through the lower reaches of the Dnieper River and linked up with a unit of the 2nd Panzer Group advancing from the north, forming the first encirclement ring southeast of Kiev. At this time, the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Karponos, still had 660,000 troops and 884 tanks, but due to Stalin's order of no retreat, they were trapped in a narrow area around Kiev. On August 25, the Germans began to tighten the encirclement. Ju-87 bombers flew 600 sorties daily, carrying out carpet bombing on Soviet positions, while ground-based Panzer IV tanks bombarded Soviet trenches with their 75mm main guns. Soviet resistance gradually shifted from organized to scattered. 32-year-old Soviet nurse Maria Kovaleva witnessed this disaster at a field hospital on the outskirts of Kiev. The hospital was set up in an abandoned flour mill, where thousands of wounded soldiers were brought in every day, and the operating tables ran non-stop from dawn to dusk. On August 30th, a German bomb fell near the hospital, and wooden planks from the roof crashed onto an operating table. Maria instinctively covered the soldier undergoing surgery with her body. Her back was scratched, but she did not stop her work. Treat the abdominal wound first, he's still breathing. By then, anesthetics had long been exhausted. Wounded soldiers bit down on towels to endure the pain, and some even fainted during surgery. Maria's hands, soaked in iodine and blood from bandaging wounds for hours on end, were pale, and her fingernails were caked with grime, yet she did not rest for a single hour. She knew that saving one more person meant one more bit of strength for resistance. On September 10, as German forces closed in on the hospital, Maria led the last group of wounded soldiers in a breakout to the northeast. Encountering a German patrol along the way, she hid the wounded in a wheat field and lured the Germans away by herself. She was finally captured and not rescued by the Allies until 1945. The final moment of the Kiev encirclement arrived on September 26. In the early morning of that day, the Germans launched a general offensive. The Sixth Army, commanded by Walter von Reichenau, advanced from west to east, the 17th Army from south to north, and armored forces compressed the encirclement from both flanks. The headquarters of the Soviet Southwestern Front attempted to organize a breakout. General Karponos personally led the Guard Battalion in a charge, but was hit by German machine gun fire and killed. By this time, most Soviet soldiers had run out of food and water. Some even fought German tanks with bayonets, but were finally forced to lay down their arms due to being outnumbered. German statistics showed that the Battle of Kiev resulted in 665,000 Soviet prisoners, 884 destroyed tanks, and 3,718 captured artillery pieces, with only 100,000 German casualties. It was the largest encirclement battle in the history of human warfare, yet it also marked the beginning of Germany's strategic miscalculations. The stalemate at Smolensk continued until September 10. During this battle, Zhukov practiced the tactic of in-depth defense plus local counterattacks. For the first time, he divided the Soviet forces into three lines. The first line held off the enemy along rivers, the second line deployed reserves for immediate support, and the third line built new defense lines in the rear. On July 23, the Soviet 16th Army launched a counterattack northwest of Smolensk. Although it failed to break through the German defense line, it forced the Germans to redeploy 8 divisions from Army Group Center for reinforcement. On August 5, the Soviet Army organized another counteroffensive in Yelnya, recapturing some lost territory and destroying 70 German tanks. These counterattacks did not change the overall situation, but bought 2 crucial months for the Battle of Moscow defense. By early September, the Soviet Army had built 3 defense lines west of Moscow, assembling 1.25 million troops, 1,000 tanks, and 7,600 artillery pieces, laying the groundwork for the subsequent winter counteroffensive. Strategic differences within the German military erupted completely during this phase. In mid-July, Hitler had ordered Army Group Center to suspend the advance on Moscow and dispatch troops to support the northern and southern flanks. Generals like Guderian strongly opposed this, arguing that we should concentrate our forces on attacking Moscow to end the war as soon as possible, while Army Group South Commander Gerd von Rundstedt insisted on first encircling Soviet forces in Kiev to eliminate the southern threat. This debate lasted 3 weeks, and Hitler finally adopted Rundstedt's suggestion, causing Army Group Center's offensive to stall for nearly a month. When the Germans restarted Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow, the Soviet winter had quietly arrived. On September 30, the German 2nd Panzer Group launched an assault toward Moscow, only to find that the Soviet defense was much stronger than expected, and the soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms, with no time to change into winter gear. The battles of Smolensk and Kiev became the watershed of the Eastern Front. Although the Germans achieved tactical victories, the Battle of Smolensk saw them occupy 100,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory, and the Battle of Kiev destroyed the main force of the Soviet Southwestern Front. They paid the price of 113,000 casualties and missed the best opportunity to attack Moscow. The Soviet army, despite heavy losses, 400,000 casualties at Smolensk and 700,000 at Kiev, developed tactics to counter Blitzkrieg through actual combat. More importantly, Stalin finally realized the flaw in holding defensive lines rigidly, and began to transfer industrial facilities to the east. By the end of September, 1,500 factories had been moved from the western regions to the Ural Mountains, providing support for subsequent weapons production. As the last ray of September's sunlight shone on the ruins of Smolensk, both sides knew that a more brutal winter campaign was about to begin on the outskirts of Moscow. Winter omen, the cold warning on Moscow's outskirts, October, December 1941. In the early hours of October 2, 1941, in the Oryol region 200 kilometers west of Moscow, 1.8 million troops of Germany's Army Group Center, including 50 infantry divisions and 14 panzer divisions, deployed their formations amid dense fog. This marked the launch of Hitler's Operation Typhoon, with the Soviet capital Moscow as its direct target. 34-year-old tank commander Gunther Müller sat in the cockpit of his Panzer IV tank. The temperature on the dashboard read 12 degrees Celsius, and late autumn rain splashed fine droplets on the tank's armor. His tank platoon, part of the 4th Panzer Division, served as the vanguard of Operation Typhoon, tasked with breaking through the Soviet Oryol defense line to open a path to Moscow for subsequent troops. At this time, the Soviet Western Front, commanded by Georgy Zhukov, had just completed the reorganization of its defense lines. 15 divisions recalled from the Far East, totaling 250,000 troops and 300 T-34 tanks, were urgently deployed along 3 defense lines from Oryol to Moscow. Soldiers dug 1,200 kilometers of trenches in 10 days and laid 800,000 anti-tank mines along both sides of the highways. The field hospital where 25-year-old Soviet nurse Maria Kovaleva served was located in an abandoned farmstead behind the Oryol defense line. She and her colleagues built 10 temporary tents with planks, each capable of holding 20 wounded soldiers, yet they prepared 500 stretchers in advance. Zhukov had emphasized in a pre-battle meeting, "This battle will be brutal, we must be ready to receive a large number of casualties." In the early stages of Operation Typhoon, the Germans advanced rapidly, relying on their armored superiority. On October 5, Gunther's tank platoon broke through the Soviet first-line defense and encountered T-34 tanks of the Soviet 16th Armored Brigade on the outskirts of Oryol. The 75 mm main gun of the German Panzer IV tank could barely penetrate the 45 mm frontal armor of the T-34 at a distance of 500 meters, so Gunther had to command his tank to circle around to the T-34's side and attack its tracks with armor-piercing shells. 2 T-34s on the left. No sooner had the company commander shouted than a Soviet shell whizzed past the turret of Gunther's tank, leaving his ears ringing. After 2 hours of fierce fighting, the Germans destroyed 6 Soviet T-34s but lost 3 tanks themselves. Gunther's tank was also hit by shrapnel, with slight damage to its tracks. On that day, Army Group Center advanced 30 kilometers and captured downtown Oryol, now only 180 kilometers away from Moscow. However, as rainfall increased in late October, the Soviet mud season arrived. Highways turned into mud pits half a meter deep, German tank tracks slipped frequently, and engineers had to lay planks to pave the road for every kilometer advanced. Gunther's tank got stuck in a mud pit during a night advance. He and his crew dug for 4 hours before being pulled out by a reinforcing tractor. His boots were soaked through with mud, and his feet were swollen and pale. Germany's logistics supply also fell into trouble. Trucks moved slowly in the mud. The daily bread ration for frontline soldiers was cut from 500 grams to 300 grams, and gasoline reserves were only enough to support half of the tank's advance distance. On October 20, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, sent a telegram to Berlin: "Mud has severely hindered the offensive, it is recommended to suspend the advance and wait for improved weather." But Hitler's reply was only one sentence: "Moscow must be captured before winter arrives, no retreat is allowed." On November 7, a military parade commemorating the October Revolution was held in Moscow's Red Square. Standing on the Lenin Mausoleum, Stalin delivered a speech to the parading troops and citizens. German fascists want to destroy our capital, but they will never succeed. Our soldiers are fighting fiercely on the front lines, and our rear is fully engaged in production. Victory will surely be ours. After the parade, the 10th Guards Infantry Division, which had participated in the parade, was directly dispatched to the Volokholamsk defense line west of Moscow. Equipped with new 76mm anti-tank guns and wearing winter cotton-padded coats, with wool linings, capable of withstanding temperatures as low as -20 degrees Celsius, just transported from the rear, this unit became the spearhead force of the Soviet defense. In late November, the Soviet winter arrived early, with temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius. Germany's predicament fully erupted. Tank engines failed to start due to the low temperature, and soldiers had to heat them with flamethrowers for half an hour before they could start. Rifle bullets froze and often jammed when the trigger was pulled. Winter clothing for soldiers was severely insufficient. In Gunther's unit, only officers were equipped with sheepskin coats, while ordinary soldiers still wore summer uniforms. Many suffered from frostbite on their hands and feet, and some even lost their lives to the bitter cold. On November 25, Gunther's tank encountered a Soviet counterattack in the Klin region 30 kilometers west of Moscow. The tank engine suddenly stalled. When he and his crew got out to push the tank, one soldier's glove stuck to the tank's armor, and when he pulled hard, he tore off pieces of his skin. "We can't even drink hot soup, and the bread is as hard as stone," Gunther wrote in his diary. On that day, his left foot was frostbitten, and he had to limp along with the unit. By this time, the Soviet army was fully prepared for a comprehensive counteroffensive. All reinforcements recalled by Zhukov from the Far East had arrived, totaling 1.25 million troops, equipped with 1,000 tanks, 40% of which were T-34s, and 7,600 artillery pieces. Soldiers were also provided with anti-slip boots, hand warmers, and high-calorie compressed biscuits, each containing 500 kilocalories. The field hospital where Maria Kovaleva worked also received heating equipment transported from Moscow. 2 iron stoves were installed in each tent for heating with firewood, and anti-frostbite ointment was provided to treat soldiers' frostbite. On December 3, when Maria treated the wounds of a Soviet soldier with severe frostbite, the soldier said gratefully, "With this ointment, I can go back to the battlefield to kill fascists." On December 5, the Soviet army launched a major counteroffensive to defend Moscow. At the Volokholamsk defense line, the 76mm anti-tank guns of the Soviet 10th Guards Infantry Division concentrated their firepower, destroying 12 German tanks and opening a breakthrough. Armored forces, with T-34 tanks as the vanguard, outflanked the German flanks and cut off their supply lines. Gunther's 4th Panzer Division was surrounded by the Soviet army. Soldiers resisted in the -30 degrees Celsius cold, and when ammunition and food ran out, many chose to surrender. On December 8, Gunther's tank was hit by a Soviet shell during a breakout attempt, breaking its tracks. He and the remaining 2 crew members abandoned the tank and fled, running 3 kilometers through the snow before being captured by the Soviet army. When captured, Gunther's left foot was severely frostbitten, and he still held a photo of his wife in his arms, with the words, "Wait for me to come home," written on the back. By the end of December, the Soviet army had repelled the Germans 100 to 250 kilometers and lifted the siege of Moscow. During this counteroffensive, the Soviet army destroyed 800 German tanks, 1,500 artillery pieces, and eliminated 500,000 German troops, 200,000 of whom died from the cold. The strength of Germany's Army Group Center dropped sharply from 1.8 million to 1.3 million, and the operational rate of tanks in the armored forces fell from 80% to 20%, completely losing the ability to attack Moscow. Due to the failure of Operation Typhoon, Hitler dismissed Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, and ordered all units to hold their positions. No retreat is allowed, but German morale had plummeted. Many soldiers wrote in their diaries, "We will never reach Moscow, this winter will kill us all." On December 31, in the snow on the outskirts of Moscow, Maria Kovaleva and her colleagues at the field hospital celebrated the New Year together. They lit a bonfire with firewood and boiled hot soup. Occasional sporadic gunshots could be heard in the distance, but more prevalent were the cheers of Soviet soldiers. Maria looked at the lights in the direction of Moscow, recalling the wounded she had treated in Smolensk in June and the comrades who had sacrificed in the harsh winter. She whispered to herself, "We have defended Moscow, the hope of victory is ahead." In the German prisoner of war camp, Gunther received a winter cotton-padded coat distributed by the Soviet army. As he watched the snowflakes outside the window, he realized for the first time, Hitler's fantasy of defeating the Soviet Union in 3 months had long been blown away by the biting winter wind, and the balance of the Eastern Front was quietly tilting in favor of the Soviet Union. On December 31, 1941, the charred traces of artillery explosions still lingered in the snow on the outskirts of Moscow. A Panzer IV tank, abandoned by the retreating German troops, was half buried in the snow, its gun barrel pointing toward the gray sky. By this day, 193 days had passed since the launch of Operation Barbarossa, and Hitler's boast of defeating the Soviet Union in 3 months had finally shattered into ice shards in the -30°C bitter cold. Looking back at this most devastating land invasion in human history, the Blitzkrieg launched by Germany with 5.5 million troops, 3,700 tanks, and 4,900 aircraft did indeed tear through the Soviet defense lines in the first half of the year. They occupied 1.5 million square kilometers of Soviet territory, captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, destroyed 22,000 tanks and 18,000 aircraft, and advanced to within 25 kilometers of Moscow, seemingly pushing the Soviet Union to the brink of collapse. Yet the cost was equally staggering. Germany suffered 1.3 million casualties, 40% of whom died from frostbite and the cold. Only 1,200 of the original 3,700 tanks remained combat-ready, more than half of the 4,900 aircraft were lost, and the logistical supplies originally planned for occupying the Soviet Union were completely exhausted along the long supply lines. The details scattered across the battlefield hold the truest weight of this campaign. Soviet soldiers at the Brest Fortress held out for 36 days. When they ran out of ammunition and food, 19-year-old signalman Pyotr Krulov carved, "We defend here until death," into the wall. During the Kiev encirclement, 60-year-old Ukrainian peasant Ivan Kovac hacked off the tracks of a German tank with an axe, and when he was shot by a machine gun, he still clutched a sack of grain he was delivering to the Soviet troops. During the defense of Moscow, 25-year-old nurse Maria Kovaleva wrapped frostbitten soldiers in her own military coat at the field hospital, losing 3 fingers to the cold herself. These people and stories, unrecorded in strategic reports, piece together the reason the Soviet Union was not defeated, not by weapons, but by the resilience of ordinary people who would rather die than surrender. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was foreshadowed from the day Hitler formulated the plan. He underestimated the 19 million square kilometers of strategic depth of the Soviet Union. The farther the German troops advanced, the longer their supply lines became. When winter arrived, the 1,600-kilometer supply line from Berlin to Moscow consumed 5,000 tons of gasoline daily. However, due to different railway gauges, 1,520 mm in the Soviet Union, 1,435 mm in Germany, supplies could only be transported by trucks, and 70% of the trucks failed to start in the -30°C cold. He also severely underestimated the Soviet Union's war potential. In the second half of 1941, the Soviet Union relocated 1,500 factories from the west to east of the Ural Mountains, producing 1,500 T-34 tanks and 2,000 fighter aircraft every month. These weapons were continuously sent to the front lines, making up for the early losses. Meanwhile, Germany's winter uniforms were not distributed until November. Many soldiers still wore summer uniforms, tank engines had no anti-freeze devices, and rifle bullets froze in the barrels. Non-combat casualties were 3 times higher than combat casualties. The victory of the defense of Moscow not only defended the Soviet capital but also shattered the myth of invincible German troops. In December 1941, the counteroffensive launched by the Soviet army repelled the Germans by 100 to 250 kilometers and lifted the siege of Moscow, this was the first large-scale strategic retreat of the German army since the outbreak of World War II. In a rage, Hitler dismissed 18 senior generals including Walther von Brauchitsch and Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, and took over as commander-in-chief of the army himself, but he could not reverse the declining fortunes on the Eastern Front. From this moment on, Nazi Germany was trapped in the dilemma of fighting a two-front war. It had to deal with British air raids on the Western Front and Soviet counterattacks on the Eastern Front. The troops originally planned for a quick victory were dragged into a prolonged war of attrition. Years later, when historians open the archives of Operation Barbarossa, they will find that the turning point of this campaign was not a specific battle, but the October Revolution anniversary parade held on November 7, 1941, in Moscow's Red Square. On that day, German artillery fire was only 20 kilometers away from the Red Square, yet after being reviewed by Stalin, Soviet soldiers marched directly from the square to the front lines. When the tracks of T-34 tanks crushed the snow and soldiers charged toward the positions singing Katyusha, the world witnessed the strength erupted by a nation in desperation. Today, flowers are placed year-round in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier in Moscow's Red Square. The inscription on the tombstone, "Your name is unknown, your deeds are immortal," etches the souls of those who sacrificed in 1941. From the Brest Fortress to the outskirts of Moscow, from the wheat fields of Kiev to the streets of Leningrad, countless Ivans, Lydias, and Marias proved with their lives that aggression may bring temporary victory, but it can never conquer a nation fighting for freedom. The lesson of Operation Barbarossa also warns the world forever: any ambition that underestimates the resilience of the opponent and ignores the power of justice will eventually be crushed by the tide of history.